Hey, so previously I did a video on how to set up rendering Phoenix FD particles like splashes and foam in Corona render or any other renderer for that matter. But I didn't really focus on optimization, so I just sort of chucked it in there and went, oh yeah, that's cool, that renders, whatever. So I figured I would go through and optimize within TyFlow to manage particles, as well as within Corona renderer, how to render things a bit faster, which you can apply not just to the foam, you can also use on some other things. So, Alright, so I've pretty much got it back to the spot where I was in the previous video. I've set it to cap at 2 passes so we can test the timing. So if I just render it now, we can see. Alright, so you can see here, so this render, it's at the most optimal settings to make it look the best. 1080 resolution, and it took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Obviously, if you want to do more passes, this is going to take ages. So we want it to sort of render as fast as we can and still look somewhat good. So we're going to be optimizing TyFlow as well as Corona sort of back and forth. So first thing I tried was optimizing TyFlow. So if we go in right click in here and we search and we tick display particle counts, you can see here straight off the bat we've got 6.5 million particles. So obviously if our shape is using a plane like a quad, then you can see here that there's 2 faces. So actually I'm rendering 13 million. So if we just change from plane to tris for both events, so we know that the exact amount of particles here is the exact amount of triangles we're going to have in our TyFlow system. So that's going to help your memory and help render speeds a little bit. Anyway, so once we've done that, the second thing I did was I started testing this material, and I realized if we just take off this gradient map, so we just keep it at full, if I give this a render now, alright, so you can see it's only taken 50 seconds. So we've basically shaved off 3 minutes from our render. But obviously it looks shit because of these, you can see they're clearly triangles and they don't have any opacity to them, which was what I found the main problem. So obviously Corona has an issue rendering with opacity. You can add an opacity map. If it's either black or white, it seems to be fine. But if it's got a middle ground, so if it's got any greys in there, then that's when it starts to slow down. So let's just copy this gradient map. And if we make this one, say we need it to be full white, and then say we just add a new one over here, and we make this one black, and then we set the interpolation to be solid. So now if we add this to our opacity, it's going to cut it out sort of like a cookie cut, so it's going to be a simple circle. So now if we render this now, alright, so you can see that the renders stay the same, but instead of having all these dodgy looking triangles, you can see now we've actually got circles. So it looks more like splashes, so we don't have to have that really annoying triangle look to everything. But obviously, because it rendered so quick, you can still use an opacity map to get the shape, you just can't use the grey. So that proves the point that using greys in opacity map slows down the render dramatically. So we can use circles, but circles don't really look the best because we haven't got any opacity. So we want to share some settings of a good material and also an optimized material. So what we can do, what's good about Corona, is we can go to this ray switch material here. So if I just add another one of those, and now if I add this ray switch material to TyFlow, and we'll just make a duplicate of this, and we'll put this back to our original one where we've got our gradient map and everything on here. So we'll put this in our opacity color. So now we've got our good material up here that uses a gradient for the opacity, which makes it look the best effect. We've also got our optimized one here. So what we can do is, over here in our ray switcher, we can choose the best of both worlds from these materials. So say usually in this one, the global illumination is the one that contains all the opacity and shadow information. So what I'll do is I'll put all these rays of the good material into every single channel except for the global illumination. So now if we render this out now, it's not going to have shadows or anything, but it's going to have that soft sort of fall-off effect. Alright, so you can see it took a little bit longer to render, but we're getting the soft sort of fall-off effect around our particles now. So we can keep that soft look to it, and not have any of the effects of the bad opacity that we're getting with global illumination. The only thing is, obviously, we lose global illumination because we don't have these particles aren't causing shadows or anything like that. Basically, what we can do is we can say, all right, well, we know this one here is optimized to render fast, so why don't we try and use this one here as the global illumination and see what happens. So if we chuck this one into this texture, what will happen is it'll keep the all the goodness of the fall-off map, but it will try and use the global illumination for this little sort of cutout texture. So we'll just give that a little render and see if we can get out some sort of shadows and illumination back. Alright, so it worked okay. So we've got our sort of soft, you can see we've got our soft particles. Our particles are also causing shadows. But it's a little bit higher, but still, it's better than 3 minutes and 40 seconds. So one thing you will notice though is that you get hard shadows. So you can't have, with this method, unfortunately, we can't have transparent shadows because it just doesn't work that way. It'll just slow down. It'll go back to the old, slow down the render time so much. So, like, this is the ideal texture we want. And this is how it looks without anything changed. So this is the nice soft opacity using the normal global illumination. And then this is the texture using a circular cutout opacity so that it renders faster. So then in the end, what we do is we just do a mix and match, and we put the nice soft opacity in every channel, in all the other channels, and then in the global illumination channel we use the circular opacity cutout. So we get sort of like the most ideal situation to render as fast as we can, with still looking as good as we can. So now we've pretty much got the ideal setup for our particles. One thing though is you'll notice that, say if I get the render back up again, you notice here you can it's pretty obvious we can see our triangles are triangles. So what we can do is, for our fall off map, we can just sort of, set this one to full black, and we can just so you can see now it's closing the circle a bit more. So the circle will exist more inside the triangle as opposed to on the outskirts of it. So we just bring that in a little bit more, and that should be right now. And also we want to do the same thing with this one. So we want to make sure that this circle here is smaller than this circle here, because if this circle we're using as our trick for global illumination it goes out of bounds of our fall off, it's going to start to look a bit weird. So we can even make this a bit smaller to to make sure it sits within the confines of this circle a bit better. Maybe go with more bok choy. What we can do now is we can start to try and optimize it a little bit more. So the splashes are probably alright. They're using 300,000 particles, which is probably alright for now. We can get away with that. But if your system starts to crash and get low on memory and all that sort of thing, it's not fun. So we can try and optimize this from 6 million particles to something a bit better. We obviously want to see all these particles right in front of us, how they are, and as dense as they are, because that's where the detail is. But we've got particles out here that you can't even see. You've got just out here, you basically, out in the background here, you can, we don't need these to be so dense because you can hardly you don't need to see those most of the time. In TyFlow, is we can add a camera cull. So if I just go add this to the foam, then I just go pick the camera. Alright, so now the first thing you can see is we've culled all these particles on this side, so they won't do anything in terms of our viewport performance anyway. So if we look back in our camera, you can see they're all there, but on the sides they're not. But you can see up here, it still says there's the same amount of particles, so it's not deleting the particles or anything. It's just keeping them here, but it's just helping our sort of performance elsewhere. I'll turn off splashes so I can work with it, and then I will turn off the physics liquid. So now I can just see our foam. So we've got all these crazy amount of particles of foam. So what we want to do now is I want to do sort of like a little trick where we say when the further away these particles are, the less dense they will be. So when the particles are closer, we want to keep the density, but when they get further away, we just want to delete heaps, like most of these particles, so we don't have to worry about them. So the way we can do that is we'll do a object test, and we'll put it after the birth. And now for the objects we want to test is the camera, so we'll just pick the camera. So now we want to check the distance, right? So best way to get an idea of how far away they are, so go to Tools, do Measure Distance, click on the camera, and then click on the furthest particle. And then down here it'll tell you how far away that was. So the camera to the last particle is about 330 meters. Let's just say in the middle. So let's say when it's about 160. So let's say when the distance is greater than 160 meters, then we want to remove them basically. So we'll add a new event which basically just deletes the particles, and now we'll send these particles into the event. So now all the particles from the middle here and then onwards from the camera should be deleted. Yep, there we go. So now, and also what that does is it updates our particles here. So we've cut the amount of particles in half, but obviously we lose all the detail back here. So what we want to do is we want to do like a fall off. So from the camera, so from our middle ground, we want to start to do the fall off or fade, if you will. So in our object test, it's got a variation. So what we can do is we can choose like an amount of a distance where it'll do the fall off. So if we do like an extra, say, 100 meters on each side, so let's do 100 and see what that does. Yeah, and we just want to keep adjusting that value until we get our furthest particles back. So maybe we'll change that to, say, 60. Alright, so now we've got our particles that are close to the camera should be just as dense as they were when we started, but the ones down here will be less dense. And you'll notice that our particles are still basically cut in half. But we can just adjust this value, so we can bring it in to make our density, we can make it even closer. So we can bring this in to, say, maybe like 120, or like maybe even like maybe 100, and then make our fall off a little bit more, so 200. Alright, so that's a pretty nice. So I'm pretty happy with that. So now we've got it down to 2 million particles. So that's pretty good. Alright, so just to reiterate what's happening so you can see a little better. You can see here, I've just set up this scene where, see in the camera view, we can see that we're looking at all these triangles. And in this view here, you can see that if I go back to TyFlow and I just stop this object test, you can see now, see how dense all this is. And if I tick it on, see it's all less dense the further away the camera is. But notice the difference in here is that it's not that noticeable. But one thing we do lose is, see, you can see that it's dense because they're all basic. Because it's so dense, you can tell. So if we enable it, you can see that back here you can it's noticeably not as dense. So what we can do is we can do another little trick. As they get further away and less dense, we just want to slightly scale them up so that they fill these little empty gaps. Not too much, but just slightly. So it's sort of like a little trick we can use, just to trick our minds to think they're still as dense as they are. So just chuck a scale operator in here. We can go down to this proximity, and we can do multiply by proximity, and then pick our camera. So now what it's going to do, when it's closer to the camera, it's going to be the same scale, but when it goes further away from the camera, they're getting smaller. So we'll just invert this. So now we've got our objects that are close to the camera are small, and the ones that are further away are big. So at distance, what we want to do is we want to bring that back to where our first sort of scale is. So maybe like there. So, actually set it to 0, because that's like right where the camera is. So set it to 0. Then our fall off, we'll just sort of bring this out so that it hits until it hits our furthest particle. So maybe let's say about there. Alright, so now it's scaling from our camera to the outer particle. And obviously it's not doing it the way we want, because it's actually making our further particles stay the same and the ones closest small. So what we want to do, we want to scale up our particles. So let's say let's scale up by 200%, just for example. So that scale up by 200%. So now from the camera to the end, they're scaling up by 200%. But obviously, it's going from complete 100% from here to there. So we can change that effect. So we want to sort of get a middle ground so that our initial particles at the front stay the same size. So we'll just set the effect to 50% on all axes down here on the effect. And now what will happen is we'll keep our sort of, it's a bit hard to see, but these particles at the back here are bigger than the particles over here. And that will just give us our little density illusion over here at the end there. Alright, so I've added into a scene. So obviously I've scaled up by 300% and about 300 meters away, and the effect's only using 75% effect. So if I go in here to the ones here close to the camera, you'll see they're really small. And then if I go zoom out to where they're less dense, they're a bit bigger. Not by much, but it's enough to sort of, it's enough to fill the gap. We can even experiment a bit more. So open this up and set it to say, let's just do 500. See what that does. So optimize it a bit. So if I go get the old calculator out and do, so there we go. So we've gone from 6.5 million particles to 2.5 million particles. Also, one thing you can do to speed it up to do low passes is you can use denoising. So if we just chuck it onto speed quality, maybe bring it down to 0.5. Turn off image filtering for that. And now if we give it a render now, so you've got, there's a comparison. So obviously one on the left is the high one, and one on the right is the optimized one. But, just depends on how long you've got to render. But yeah, I think it's a pretty passable method. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope it helped. Yeah, cheers, thanks.